Great. So thank you all for being here. I know in Nassau we have a provocative group. And so this afternoon, I have the privilege of speaking on extreme weather events, hurricanes, floods, and droughts. My name is Dr. William Hamilton, and I will be speaking along with colleague and mentor, Professor James Schultz out of the University of Miami. Let's get these slides moving. And so our learning objectives for this session are to describe the ways in which climate change increases risk of extreme events, such as hurricanes, extreme precipitation, floods, and droughts, identify short and long-term health threats, discuss how disasters impact mental health, which is sometimes often neglected, specifically with regards to stress disorder, depression, domestic abuse, violence, aggression, and then also define how communities and health systems can prepare for and respond to extreme weather events, including communication, early warning systems, cooperation, preparedness, and other details. So what is a hurricane? Let's start with some foundation. And so a hurricane is a type of cyclone. And we categorize it as a hurricane once wind speeds reach above 74 miles per hour. And a hurricane has a frame. And so we always hear about the eye of the storm. And so the eye of the storm is that centerpiece demarcated by this circle. And then you have the eye wall and then the rain bands. And in the Bahamas, well, in the region, we should all know that our hurricane season runs from June 1st to November 30th. So we've been realizing now that sometimes isn't even standing true because we're actually seeing some storms and systems developing after November 30th. So we have a hurricane wind scale called the Saffir-Simpson scale. And this is based off of wind speed. So category 1, we have wind speeds anywhere from 119 to 150 kilometers per hour. And then we go all the way to category 5, okay? And as we know, the more intense a storm is, the greater damage to homes, livelihood, animals, you name it. Our last major storm was Hurricane Dorian, and that was like a category 10, right? But we like storytelling. And so our story is going to be focused around Rose. And Rose is who we're going to follow through our hurricane experience. So news is coming of a big hurricane. Rose is a seasoned veteran. She knows all about hurricanes, so she decided to stock up on food, put plywood on the windows, check up on neighbors like a good community citizen. But when we speak about preparing for hurricanes, this is the one time you listen to Basil. The one time. If one time we can listen to meteorology, it's going to be when it comes to hurricane, right? And if not before Hurricane Dorian, after Hurricane Dorian, I find as though more people are in tune with what's going on in the weather, okay? And so forecasting has gotten much more precise and accurate over the years. It's still not a perfect science, but we have to use forecasts to guide us. So if our Met Department says that a storm is coming, don't wait till the day before or 12 hours before to think I am going to evacuate or to run to Super Value or to Maxwell's or to Sullivan's in Grand Bahama, okay? These forecasts are used to help us with our preparedness. So Rose is at home and she's literally watching from a window as floodwaters block the streets. The floodwater damages the power lines, her power goes out, water begins to enter her home. She's worried about drowning and wonders if there's sewage mixed in the water, okay? Now, we have been hearing a lot about this thing called storm surge, okay? And this is when the wind pushes water onto the land. And it can be as high as 6 feet. And in Hurricane Dorian, we saw storm surges up to 2 stories high, okay? And that's, I have a few Hurricane Dorian survivors in here with me. And so they know all too well about what we went through with storm surges in Abaco, okay? And so a challenge that we have is that when floodwaters run into a town, then our septic systems are based in the ground. And so that sewage sometimes can rise. And now you have a mixture of toxins with the seawater coming in. And a case in point in Abaco and Grand Mama, where people literally had to wade through the water. Imagine now you're wading through water filled with things that was belong in a septic tank. Okay. So now imagine what comes into the clinic for healthcare providers and even community members to have to deal with. So sea level rise is a major issue, especially in the Caribbean. 80% of the Bahamas is at sea level, or, we have about 5 feet, 6 feet to play with, okay? And so forecasting has showed, and if you look at this diagram, we are at 2000 and between 2050. And as we continue to pump out a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, we're noticing that if we stay on the trend that we are, our sea levels are going to go above the state, where pretty much there'll be no more Bahamas. And so we sometimes talk about this talk of climate refugees. The Bahamas is at stake of being, as a nation, becoming a climate refugee and knocking on someone else's door to take us in if we don't start to get more serious about climate change and its impact on health. And so after the storm, Rose's home is still standing, but it was partly flooded. It smells awful and doesn't have any working plumbing or power. Once the water starts to go down, Rose needs to find a safe place to stay with her daughter. There are some local shelters, and some people she knows are evacuated, but she finds a friend to stay with for a few days. And that story was all too well known, especially, again, in Abaco, where even some of the shelters were compromised, all right? And so we have to now talk about, how do we build back resilient? How do we build back bigger and better? And that is a multi-pronged approach. When we speak about resiliency, we speak about our building designs and what our building code looks like. And so we've been having a lot of conversation with the Ministry of Public Works to see how we could implement a building design that's the code that everybody has to follow. And so everybody, in my opinion, should be building on what we call stilts or piles, right? So when the water, we have these storm surges, that water just flows, right? At least some of it will flow underneath the home, right? Other models are showing that your ground floor is almost like a shell, and you move your kitchen and other things up to the second floor, right? So again, if you have that much water coming in, at least you're safe on the second floor, all right? So these are things to consider when we're building back. Now let's look at the health impacts. So a week after the storm, Rose's daughter develops a cough, a fever, and won't eat. They try to call a doctor, but the phone's not working. The local clinic is damaged and had to close, and they have to travel to an unfamiliar clinic or hospital to treat her pneumonia. And for my healthcare professionals in here, we know this is a very bad pneumonia. This is an X-ray of a chest, and we're showing that most of her lung field has infection in it, okay? And so when we think about extreme weather events and some of the health conditions that we can have, these were some of the pictures I took while in Abaco about some of the things that we dealt with in the first 72 hours in Hurricane Dorian. And so we expect to see persons with puncture wounds, deep lacerations. So we pretty much had a suture bay where we literally sutured nonstop. We also have people coming in with skin flaps. This gentleman, a piece of plywood ran across his eye. So the trauma is extremely real. We also had antenatal emergencies. The day prior, we actually had a baby delivered in the clinic. All right. We also have our chronic non-communicable diseases such as hypertension and diabetes, and sometimes stress and other reasons, they go out of control. We have dialysis patients, chemo patients. So everything was thrown at us, but we had to find a way to manage, okay? And not only just thinking about the healthcare workforce, we also need to look at our infrastructure. And so hospital administrators have an awesome responsibility in making sure that the building is secured. And so we have to look at our supplies, whether that's the sandbags, whether that's medication, making sure generators have diesel, et cetera, that we've been talking about in our other groups. So what's next? Rose has that climate change may mean even worse storms in the future. So she wonders what she can do to keep her family safe. And again, we spoke about how do we build back resilient, but more importantly, on an individual, community, hospital level, we need to ensure that we have our evacuation plans, disaster plans in place. And we are talking about community, so we have to ensure that our community is definitely engaged. So does climate change impact hurricanes? Absolutely. Hurricanes are becoming stronger, intensifying faster. They are pouring much more rain and moving much slower. As we saw in Abaco and Grand Palmer, where just sat over us for some time. And this right here is actually a picture of Dorian moving across Abaco. And you'll notice shortly where it literally just comes to a halt and just pours rain and wind all over. So extreme rain and flooding. So what does science say? Science says that we're going to have wet days can increase a little by the end of the century, okay? And these projection changes are accompanied by little or no change in total annual rainfall. Again, preaching the same message. How are we building our homes now, all right? Elevated living spaces, well-designed drainage, making sure key infrastructure such as hospitals, our electrical grid are safe, emergency plans, we have medication on stock for our patients, and as patients, ensuring that you get a minimum of a 2-month supply if you know that a storm is traveling, because if your clinic is overwhelmed or damaged, it's going to be very difficult for you to come into clinic to get a box of Predarax to control your blood pressure. And so this sums it all up. Climate change is having a massive impact on health. Physical health, we touched on. It also plays a role with community health. We spoke about displacement, how we can become climate refugees, and also mental health. And the mental health component or the psychological consequences is where I'm going to turn over to my colleague and mentor, Dr. James Schultz, to carry us through the rest of the presentation. Over to you, sir.
So thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with Dr. Hamilton. And he and his wife, Dr. Holder Hamilton, were really, truly heroes in Marsh Harbor during Dorian. Dr. Hamilton has really become one of the climate leads, along with Dr. Philippe at the Ministry of Health. And this is such a remarkable group together. I serve on an editorial board with Dr. Sorensen, so it's like old home week and really a delight to be here. I just have several minutes of comments about psychosocial consequences and a little bit on mental health and psychosocial support. Next slide, please. When we talk about psychosocial consequences, we want to talk about the attributes that are focusing on psychological footprint, spectrum of severity, range of duration, and also type of disaster matters, particularly in terms of what sorts of hazards are at play, and therefore what sorts of exposures might create psychological and psychosocial consequences. Next slide, please. So one of our contributions at Deep Center, maybe the best known one, from 2003, was to introduce the concept of the psychological footprint. Generally, more people are affected psychologically in a disaster or extreme event than are harmed physically or need medical attention. So we say quite simply, the psychological footprint is larger than the medical footprint. In fact, it might exceed the size of the medical footprint greatly. Next slide, please. Dr. Robert Ursano, Chief of Psychiatry and also the Director of the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress at the Uniformed Services University, back in the post 9/11 era, introduced the concept that in a public health emergency, psychosocial consequences extend along a spectrum of severity. And what you see here is the good news is the default, the most common and the most expectable outcome, even in extraordinary, extreme Dorian scale events, is resilience. Most people bounce back. Most people emerge resilient. And most people, in fact, master adversity. But as you see here, Distress reactions are very common, particularly for those who are exposed, and health risk behaviors might be evident in those who have even more intense exposure. So some people go on to diagnosable psychiatric disorders. And the psychiatric disorders of greatest consequence, the common mental disorders are major depression, generalized anxiety. Of course, you're thinking, can you back up one slide? You're also thinking PTSD, which is a disorder of event exposure, and substance use disorder, depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance use, and again, upper right corner, severity
There are
relates to
elements where we had heat stroke, right? So my suggestion was, why not make more green spaces? Why not plant? Why not go
I think
open
we're
your
hearing
or
some
plant
other,
more trees within urban heat islands? Yeah, we've been
Haley,
thank you. Can you hear me?
yes, we can.
Okay,
Yes.
so upper right corner, severity relates to the degree and intensity of exposure. So this consider this a continuum from people emerging resilient to people actually needing to deal with diagnosable psychopathology. Next slide, please. We've talked about the psychological footprint, the spectrum of severity. The third attribute of psychosocial consequences is the range of duration. And let's talk about Dorian. So one click, please. The hazard phase of Hurricane Dorian seemed to never end. For almost 2.5 days, as you just saw with the image of Dorian passing over Elbow Key, Marsh Harbor, and then continuing on across a good portion of Grand Bahama, lasted 2.5 to 3 days with hurricane force winds. That is extraordinarily long for a hurricane, and the people beneath the canopy felt like it would never end. On the other hand, those 3 days were more than 3 years ago. So what continues in terms of psychological consequences to today? Next click, please. Resource losses. Many people are not back to the Abacos now. They have lost personal possessions. Many have lost their homes. Even more grievous and absolutely memorialized to this day, the loss of life, of loved ones, neighbors, and community members. Click again, please. The other thing which continues to this day is enduring life changes. Perhaps the most notable, almost 10,000 people were displaced. Many of them are still on other islands. So hazard exposure, fairly time limited, but psychological consequences don't stop when the hazard moves on. They actually continue to the present day. Next slide. So here, in fact, actually to sort of pinpoint and emphasize that, a recent publication from Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, where if you actually look on the right-hand side, you'll see one example of what hazards the people of Marsh Harbor were exposed to: storm surge up to 7 meters, along with the winds and the slow-moving storm. Loss in the center column, mortality, 70 known dead, many more never found again. And life change, right-hand column, almost 10,000 people displaced, many still to this day. Next slide. So we started writing right away. And at that point, with the Minister of Health at the moment of impact, Jim Costin, who is a renowned atmospheric scientist, who, like Dr. Hamilton mentioned, is one of the foremost scientists who let us know how these storms are now stronger, they are wetter, they intensify, and they also tend to slow down overpopulated areas. Dorian was the quintessential example of all of those attributes. But notice we also have Sandro Galea, who is noted for some of the most salient studies in the field of mental health in hurricane disasters. We called this double environmental injustice. And injustice number one, small island states contribute almost negligibly to greenhouse gas emissions and global warming, but get pounded by the strongest storm hazards. Injustice number two is that the poorest of the poor get the worst of the worst. So even with the utter devastation of Marsh Harbor, clearly the people in the shanty towns, the mud and Pigeon Peas, got the worst of the worst. And those were the poorest of the poor. So, by the way, along with this New England Journal article came a podcast. I was interviewed briefly, but also your very own Krista Nottage was also on the podcast. You can listen to it to this day. Now, we also wrote about mental health consequences specifically in health affairs, and we entitled this Scrambling for Safety in the Eye of Dorian, which was a literal event that took place. And Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Holder Hamilton were actually at the clinic receiving massive numbers of people who came to seek shelter and came to seek medical care. So you'll see on the author list, Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Holder Hamilton, Dr. Gowd, Dr. Krista Nottage, and Dr. Sands, 5 of your Bahamian physicians. So remarkable folks on board. And we also have my wife, who's about to make another trip yet to Bahamas. She is a psychiatrist who was looking at the mental health issues in Bahamas, and she works at University of Miami School of Medicine. Next slide, please. So the fourth attribute, remember we had psychological footprint, spectrum of severity, range of duration, but I mentioned type of disaster matters. We've got a literal buffet of possible disaster events. So on the left side, you see natural hazards. This comes from the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters, 6 different buckets, and you can see the types of disasters. The folks who run the center actually use really long terms: meteorological, climatological, hydrological, geophysical, biological, extraterrestrial, but those are the interiors of each of the buckets. On the other side, we see the anthropogenic, human created hazards. Many of those are technological failures. They're not intentional. Deepwater Horizon is probably one of the best examples. And we certainly have got intentional acts of mass violence, terrorism, and war. Think Ukraine. But in a very long time perspective, and I've just come to this meeting from another meeting where we're working with folks who are Venezuelan migrants, for example, in Colombia. And these are very complex emergencies and humanitarian crises of very prolonged duration. I think as you look at this, this is sufficient. This is such a remarkable array of disasters. It's like, what else could happen? But I serve on the Compounding Disasters Consensus Committee for National Academies, and here's what can happen: compounding disasters. Could I have 2 quick clicks, please? What you see, of course, is that number one, we've got the COVID, one more click. We've got the COVID pandemic, which has been happening now for pretty close to 3 years. And this has been an overlay and a complicator for every other type of disaster and extreme event. But today, one of the most important features of today's discussion in NASA, and with inclusion of the Apicoast and Grand Bahama, is one more click, of course, climate change. So what we have are these kind of stacked, multi-layered disaster events that are happening. And so when we're looking at how we prepare Bahamas or any other population in potentially harm's way for disasters, we have to understand that we do not just talk about discrete events, but we actually have got this ongoing continuum that gets more and more complex and highly layered. Next slide, please. So just a couple of final wrap-up slides. How do we handle this? The basics of mental health and psychosocial support, what in the States we call disaster behavioral health, everyone else calls MHPSS, is to look at, well, what are the elements that go into supporting people who've just gone through a disaster and have been exposed to disaster hazards? After 9/11, more than 20 experts in the field of disaster behavioral health, or MHPSS, globally came together and they said, what do we know? And they came out with 5 essential elements of early intervention for overcoming adversity and also emerging resilient from disasters. And the 5 elements are safety, calming, connectedness, self-efficacy, and hope. But let me give that to you in a slightly different presentation, talking again about Dorian. Next slide, please. What happens in disaster situations, Dorian is probably the ultimate example recently for Bahamas, is that people are in extraordinary danger. I thought I was going to die level exposures to storm hazards. So what you need to do is to move them from danger, click, to safety, okay? And that's exactly what happened, where people themselves, in the eye of the hurricane, moved from destroyed habitats to the Marsh Harbor Clinic and to the government house, and later on to other places of safety, like on other islands. So they needed to move themselves physically from danger to safety. And then, of course, understandably, they had extreme distress during the time that the storm was bombarding them. And what we needed to do, what the Holders and Hamiltons, Holder Hamiltons needed to do at Marsh Harbor Clinic and in the government house was to help people just keep it together and calm. But later on, many people had need for actual psychological and psychiatric intervention. During disasters, people may be disconnected. They may be separated from loved ones. And so what we want to do is to move them to family reunification centers, another click, please, and to places where they can reconnect, where they can search for missing loved ones, and hopefully be able to reunify and then come together even as a badly damaged community to build back better. And of course, also we've got dysfunction. People do not function well in extreme stress situations. And what we want to do over a period of time is to build back that sense of self-efficacy. Now that's jargony, but self-efficacy is basically a sense of competence and capability. Okay, so how do we get people back to feel like I can do things? So it's a can-do-ness that we're talking about with self-efficacy. And finally, people in extreme disasters may feel hopelessness and despair. And what we want to do is to rekindle hope. We want to move people forward to a point where they feel confident and they reestablish self-esteem. So going forward, just one more slide only. We have just developed for the Florida Department of Health what they called a self-care toolkit. And here's an image of that self-care toolkit that goes along with a presentation given to all Florida Department of Health employees who were frontline personnel. And what they want to do is to, we talk about in our presentation, which is the front end of a larger program, how do you design a resilient lifestyle? And then we have certain tools that go into each of those drawers. And those 5 drawers are literally the 5 essential elements of early intervention and ongoing intervention. These 5 elements, by the way, are the underpinning for the many models you've heard about of psychological first aid. There's WHO, there's Red Cross, various Red Crosses, and Red Crescent societies use this. There's a National Center for Child Traumatic Stress, fairly well-known first aid model in the US. And there's also something called stress first aid, which was retooled and redesigned for healthcare professionals during COVID. So stress first aid is grounded on these elements. Psych first aid is grounded on these elements. It's a really core set of elements. How you use them and adapt them to Bahamas is, one of the major things that probably your psychological association and others are doing to make sure it really fits with the culture and the personality of persons in Bahamas. But these are really core elements that we know are beneficial psychologically and diminish the impact of disasters. That's the end of my comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schultz, for being here with us today. We greatly appreciate you tuning in. And so in everybody's packet, you should have received a handout on hurricane safety. And so we're going to move right into our collaborative exercises.